Hello everyone and welcome to Group 7 presentation. Today we are going to explore a foundational principle of international law, but we are going to look at it through a very specific and profound lens, the Islamic perceptions of Pacta Sunt Servanda. So let's start with the basic. What does Pacta Sunt Servanda means? It is a Latin phrase that translates to agreement must be kept. This is a fundamental principle in international law. So it dictates that states must honor the agreement they make. Interestingly, the principle applies equally in both secular international law and in Islamic international law, which is known as Sharia. So here we have 5 discussions. The first is Introduction to Pacta Doctrine. The second one is Understanding Contracts in Sharia, and then the third is Basic Principle of Theology and Morality, and next is the example from history in Islamic state practice, and lastly is conclusion. So you might ask, why is this relevant today? Well, in the modern world, we frequently see that many states fail to honor their agreements. There is a significant rise in treaty disputes globally. A prime example of this can be seen in the violation of bilateral investment treaties or BITs. These are serious disputes often managed by the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. So, how do different legal systems view these problems? There are different perspectives. In the Western legal tradition, keeping agreement is largely seen as a practical tool to maintain stability in society. However, in Islam, the concept goes much deeper. It is viewed as a profound moral and spiritual obligation. And next is Understanding Contracts in Sharia. So, to understand this spiritual obligation, we have to look at the Islamic legal concept of contracts. In Sharia, the Arabic word for a contract is akad. This concept is explicitly found in the Quran, specifically in Surah Al-Ma'idah. So in Islam, akad is a broad term that covers several different types of commitments. It represents 3 distinct levels. First, it represents the foundational covenant between humans and Allah. Second, it covers personal promises and vows that individuals make. And third, it governs the formal agreements made between people, groups, or sovereign states. Because of this framework, fulfilling contracts is not just a suggestion. It is mandatory or fard. It is a direct command from the Quran and crucially for our study of international relations. This command applies directly to matters of governance and leadership. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Now, I am Fathan's partner. My name is Fatih and I'm going to explain the rest of our topics here. And now, for the basic principles of theology and morality. So, this brings us to the basic principles of theology and morality in Islam. In Islamic faith, keeping agreements is not merely a legal rule, and it is a deep spiritual and theological obligation. So, why is it so sacred? It roots back to the beliefs that every human being made an original covenant with Allah, acknowledging Him as their Lord. And because of this original divine promise, fulfilling your earthly promise becomes a core part of your faith, known as Iman. So, when a Muslim leader or state signs a treaty, those agreements are seen as a form of accountability before Allah, and not just social responsibility to the international community, which this elevates the promise keeping to both strict moral duty and an actual act of worship. Up to the next one, which is now we're gonna talk about the ethical meaning of keeping the agreements. So because it is an act of worship, the ethical meaning of breaking an agreement is severe, which breaking agreements is considered as a major sin in Islam, not just a minor legal mistake. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad described the breaking of promises as a sign of hypocrisy or nifaq, and violating agreements leads to widespread injustice, the loss of societal trust, and social instability. Therefore, it is strictly forbidden to break agreements just to gain a personal, political, or military advantage, and this political standard applies universally, governing both individual human behavior and state-level actions. Next one, the historical practice in CR. So, theory is important, but how did this look in practice? So, let's look at the historical practice in CR, or Islamic International Law. So, these Islamic teachings on agreements were not just ideals, they were actively applied in real governance during the Prophet Muhammad's leadership. Historical records show that agreements were consistently prioritized even when the Muslims were in incredibly difficult political and military situations. This demonstrates that Islamic principles are highly practical in real-world international relations. Moral consistency was strictly maintained even when it created a strategic disadvantage for the Muslim community. So now, we're talking about the key historical examples. So the first one, which is the Battle of Badr, or Perang Badar. So before the battle, two companions of the Prophet honored a promise they had made to their enemies not to fight. They kept this promise even though the Muslim army was heavily outnumbered and desperately needed soldiers. And the second one is the famous Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So in this treaty, the Muslims accepted highly unfavorable terms. Because of this treaty, they even returned a fellow Muslim, Abu Jandal, to his captors despite his suffering. The law of the treaty was upheld over personal emotion. And finally, what happens when a treaty is violated? So when the opposing group, the Quraysh, broke the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the treaty became invalid. However, instead of taking violent revenge, the Prophet chose the path of forgiveness. Even during this conflict, agreements with other groups who had not broken their word were still fully respected and maintained by the Muslims. Okay, now we have come to the summary and the key takeaway of our discussion. So, in Islam, the doctrine of Pacta Sunt Servanda is elevated to a divine command, far beyond just a secular legal principle. Keeping agreements is directly, inseparably connected to faith, morality, and justice. The leadership of the Prophet Muhammad provides us with a real-life model of how consistent and ethical statecraft should be conducted. We see that agreements were honored even in situations that require immense difficulty and sacrifice. So yeah, the ultimate takeaway from the Islamic perspective in this is peace and stability are the result of obedience to Allah and a strict commitment to honoring agreements. And peace is not merely the primary objective itself, and by fulfilling our contracts with one and another, we fulfill our ultimate contract with the divine. Okay, so that is from our group. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this video that we have provided can provide you with a deeper understanding of how international law and Islamic principle intersect. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.